Detective Ryan Torres stepped off the plane at Heathrow Airport, his black tactical bag slung over his shoulder. After 15 years with the Los Angeles Police Department's SWAT team, he thought he'd seen it all. Street gangs, bank robberies, hostage situations, you name it, he'd been there. But London? This was completely new territory. The morning air felt different here. Cooler, damper, with that famous English fog hanging low over the city. Ryan pulled his jacket tighter as he made his way through the airport. He'd volunteered for this international exchange program without really knowing what to expect. 6 months in London, working alongside British law enforcement, learning their methods while sharing what he knew about American tactics. His captain back in LA had called it a career opportunity. Ryan wasn't so sure. He preferred the familiar streets of downtown Los Angeles, where he knew every alley and understood how things worked. Here, everything seemed backwards. Even the cars drove on the wrong side of the road. The taxi ride into central London was like watching a movie. Double-decker buses, black cabs everywhere, and buildings that looked older than his entire country. The driver, a chatty man named Bob, pointed out landmarks along the way. "That's Westminster Bridge there, mate. And look, you can see Big Ben from here." Ryan nodded politely, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about the briefing packet he'd received before leaving LA, the Metropolitan Police's specialist. Firearms units operated very differently from American SWAT teams. More restraint, more protocol, more everything that wasn't about getting the job done quickly. When he arrived at his hotel near Scotland Yard, Ryan checked in and immediately called his wife back home. "Hey, honey, made it safe and sound. Yeah, it's exactly like you see in the movies." "No, I haven't met any guards with the funny hats yet." His wife laughed on the other end. "Be nice, Ryan. You're representing all of us over there." I know. I'll play nice with the Brits." But as he hung up the phone, Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that this was going to be more challenging than he'd anticipated. He'd read about British police procedures during the flight. Everything seemed so formal, so by the book. Back home, when seconds counted, you acted first and filled out paperwork later. Here, it seemed like they filled out paperwork before, during, and after every decision. The next morning, Ryan reported to New Scotland Yard for his orientation. The building itself was impressive, all glass and steel, very modern despite the historic name. He was greeted by Inspector David Clark, a tall, thin man with graying temples who spoke in that crisp British accent that sounded like every BBC documentary Ryan had ever watched. "Welcome to London, Detective Torres," Inspector Clark said, shaking Ryan's hand firmly. "We're quite excited to have you here. The exchange program has been tremendously successful over the years." They spent the morning going over protocols, procedures, and what the British called proper channels. Ryan tried to pay attention, but it all seemed unnecessarily complicated. In LA, if there was a problem, you solved it. Here, you apparently needed to consider 17 different factors and get approval from 3 separate departments first. "Now then," Inspector Clark said, consulting his notes, "we'll start you off with some observational assignments." "Nothing. Too intensive. Just get a feel for how we do things here." Ryan raised an eyebrow. "Observational? I was hoping to actually work some cases." "Oh, you will. But we like to ease our exchange officers into the British way of doing things. Cultural differences and all that." Cultural differences. Ryan was already getting tired of that phrase, and it was only his first day. The afternoon brought his first real taste of British law enforcement. He was assigned to accompany a patrol unit through central London, focusing on the high-security areas around government buildings. The patrol car was smaller than what he was used to, and the officers, Constables Williams and Johnson, seemed almost impossibly polite. "Right then, Detective Torres," Constable Williams said as they drove through the busy London streets. "Today we'll be doing our routine security checks around the government quarter. Parliament, Downing Street, and of course Buckingham Palace." Buckingham Palace. Ryan had to admit he was curious about that one. He'd seen it in movies and TV shows his whole life, but actually being there would be something else entirely. As they approached the famous palace gates, Ryan was struck by how ordinary it all seemed in some ways. Yes, there were the iconic red uniformed guards he'd heard so much about, standing perfectly still with their tall black hats and rifles. But there were also regular police officers, security cameras, and metal barriers, the same kind of practical security measures you'd see protecting any important building. Impressive, isn't it? Constable Johnson said, noticing Ryan's interest. The household division has been guarding the monarch for centuries. Longest continuous military tradition in the world, they say? Ryan watched as tourists gathered around the gates, taking photos and hoping to see the famous changing of the guard ceremony. The guards themselves stood motionless, like statues in bright red uniforms. Ryan had to admit it was impressive, but he couldn't help wondering how effective it really was from a security standpoint. Do they actually do any real security work? Ryan asked, or is it all just for show? Constable Williams looked a bit offended. Oh no, detective, they're fully trained soldiers. The ceremonial duties are just one part of their job. These are serious military personnel, not actors in costumes. Ryan nodded, but he remained skeptical. Back home, security was about being alert, mobile, and ready to respond instantly to any threat. Standing perfectly still for hours seemed like the opposite of good security practice. They spent the rest of the afternoon driving around the government district. Ryan observed the various security measures, some obvious, some subtle. The British approach was definitely different from what he was used to. More layered, more formal, but also somehow more relaxed. American security tended to be more aggressive, more visible. Here, much of the real security seemed to happen behind the scenes. As the day ended and they returned to Scotland Yard, Inspector Clark asked Ryan for his initial impressions. Well, Ryan said carefully, it's definitely different from what we do back home, more traditional, I guess? Inspector Clark smiled. Yes, we do tend to value tradition here. But don't mistake tradition for ineffectiveness, detective. Our methods have been refined over centuries. There's wisdom in time-tested approaches. Ryan just nodded politely. He wasn't convinced, but he'd promised to keep an open mind. After all, he was here to learn, not to judge. At least that's what he kept telling himself that evening. Alone in his hotel room, Ryan video called his partner back in L.A. How's it going over there? Detective Mike Santos asked from the familiar surroundings of their squad room. It's different, Mike. Really different. Everything's so formal and traditional. I'm not sure how much I'm actually going to learn here. Give it time, Ryan. You've only been there one day. Yeah, I know. But these guys seem more interested in ceremony than actual police work. I watched guards standing around in funny uniforms all day instead of doing real security. Mike laughed. Come on, man. You knew it was going to be different. That's the whole point of the exchange program. Ryan sighed. You're right. I just hope I can actually contribute something useful while I'm here instead of just watching parades and ceremonies for 6 months. Little did Ryan know that his chance to make a real impact was coming much sooner than he expected. 3 weeks into his London assignment, Ryan Torres was starting to get the hang of British police procedures. He'd learned to drink tea instead of coffee during briefings, mastered the art of saying brilliant instead of awesome, and could almost understand what his colleagues meant when they talked about things being quite good or rather concerning. But he still felt like an outsider looking in. This particular Tuesday morning started like any other. Ryan met up with his assigned observation team at 7 a.m. sharp. Today's assignment was perimeter security around Buckingham Palace, one of the most high-profile locations in all of London. Inspector Clark had specifically requested that Ryan spend extra time studying how the British handled VIP protection. Right then, Detective Torres, said Sergeant Pete Hawkins, a stocky man with 20 years of experience in royal protection, today we're observing the morning security protocols. Big day today, there's a state visit scheduled for next week. So security's been stepped up. Ryan nodded, adjusting his observer's badge. After weeks of watching, he was eager to see something more action-packed than tourists taking selfies and guards standing at attention. The morning crowd around the palace was typical for a Tuesday. School groups on field trips, elderly tourists, with cameras hung around their necks, and the usual collection of street performers and souvenir sellers working the crowds. Ryan watched it all with trained eyes, automatically scanning for anything unusual. That's when he noticed something that made his stomach tighten. A man in a dark jacket was moving through the crowd differently than everyone else, while tourists wandered aimlessly, taking photos and chatting. This guy had purpose. He was studying the security barriers, checking sightlines, and most importantly, he kept looking at his watch like he was timing something. Ryan had seen this behavior before. Back in LA, this kind of pre-operational surveillance usually meant trouble was coming. "Sergeant Hawkins," Ryan said quietly, "you see the guy in the dark jacket near the main gate? Baseball cap, keeps checking his watch?" Hawkins followed Ryan's gaze and shrugged. "Probably just waiting for someone, mate. Tourists do that all the time." But Ryan's instincts were screaming. In Los Angeles, this exact behavior pattern had preceded 3 different incidents he'd responded to. The way the man moved, the way he avoided making eye contact with security cameras, the systematic way he was studying the perimeter, it all added up to threat assessment. "I don't think so," Ryan said, his voice taking on the edge it got when danger was near. "Watch how he's moving. He's not lost. He's not waiting for friends. He's studying the security setup." Hawkins looked again, but seemed unconvinced. "Detective Torres, with respect, you might be reading too much into this. We see dozens of people like this every day." Ryan watched as the suspicious man moved closer to the outer security barrier. The man pulled out what looked like a phone, but instead of taking photos like a normal tourist, he seemed to be making notes or measurements. Every alarm bell in Ryan's head was going off. Meanwhile, just inside the palace gates, guardsman Billy Thompson was having a perfectly normal morning. 8 years of ceremonial duty had taught him to expect the unexpected from tourists, but mostly his job involved standing very still and looking impressive in his red uniform and bearskin hat. Billy had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before joining the household division. He knew the difference between real danger and tourist curiosity. But the ceremonial nature of his current post meant following very specific protocols. You didn't break formation unless there was an immediate, obvious threat through his peripheral vision. You learned to see everything without moving your head when you were on guard duty. Billy noticed some commotion near the outer barriers. One of the American exchange officers seemed agitated about something, back at the observation point. Ryan was getting more concerned by the minute. The suspicious man had now moved to a position where he could see multiple security checkpoints at once. He was definitely conducting surveillance, and in Ryan's experience, surveillance usually meant someone was planning something bad. "Sergeant, I really think we need to check this guy out," Ryan said, his voice more urgent now. "Detective Torres? I understand your concern, but we can't approach every person who looks at the palace gates. We'd be questioning half of London." That's when things went sideways. The man in the dark jacket suddenly moved with purpose toward one of the security barriers. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something that, from Ryan's angle, looked like it could be a weapon. Without thinking, 15 years of SWAT training kicked in. Ryan moved. He didn't announce himself to Sergeant Hawkins. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't follow British protocol. He simply did what his training had drilled into him for 15 years, neutralized the threat before it became a tragedy. Ryan sprinted across the courtyard area, using a tactical approach pattern that allowed him to keep the suspect in sight, while minimizing his own exposure. He came in from an angle the man wouldn't expect, moving fast and low. "Police, show me your hands," Ryan shouted, using the command voice that had stopped dozens of criminals in their tracks back in LA. The man spun around, startled, and that's when Ryan saw what was actually in his hand. It was a guidebook. A tourist guidebook with a small pen attached to it, but Ryan was already committed to his approach. In those split seconds, with adrenaline pumping and years of training taking over, he continued his tactical advance. He grabbed the startled tourist by the arm and quickly secured him against the security barrier. "What are you doing?" "I'm just reading about the palace," the man said in a thick German accent, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. It was at that moment that Ryan realized two things. First, he just tackled an innocent tourist who was simply taking notes about British history. Second, he'd done it right in front of Guardsman Thompson and about 50 other people, including several with cameras. Guardsman Billy Thompson watched this whole scene unfold with a mixture of professional concern and complete bewilderment. The American officer had just performed what looked like a military-style takedown on someone who was clearly just a tourist. This was not how things were done at Buckingham Palace. Billy faced an immediate dilemma. His orders were to maintain his post and not break formation except in cases of direct threat to the royal family or property. But an international incident was apparently happening right in front of him, and protocol didn't exactly cover what to do when a visiting American policeman tackled a German tourist. The crowd around the gates had gone completely silent. Everyone was staring. Someone's camera was definitely recording. Sergeant Hawkins came running over, his face red with embarrassment and anger. "Detective Torres, what on earth are you doing?" Ryan looked down at the confused German tourist, then at the guidebook that had fallen to the ground, then at the crowd of shocked onlookers. His heart was still pounding from the adrenaline rush, but reality was starting to sink in. He was acting suspiciously. The way he was moving, studying the perimeter. "He's a tourist," Hawkins said, helping the German man to his feet and apologizing profusely. "Sir, I'm terribly sorry about this misunderstanding. Are you hurt?" The German tourist, whose name turned out to be Klaus Müller, and who was a retired schoolteacher from Munich, was more confused than angry. "I was just reading about the history of the palace. I take notes when I travel. Was that wrong?" Ryan felt about 2 inches tall. In Los Angeles, his aggressive approach would have been understood, even praised if there had been a real threat. But here, in front of one of the most famous buildings in the world, with tourists and cameras everywhere, it looked like exactly what it was: an American cop who didn't understand British culture making a very public mistake. Guardsman Thompson, meanwhile, was trying to figure out if he should report this incident up the chain of command immediately or wait for his shift to end. Either way, he had a feeling this was going to mean a lot of paperwork and some very uncomfortable conversations with his superiors. As Sergeant Hawkins continued apologizing to Klaus Müller and the gathering crowd began to disperse, Ryan stood there wondering if his career in international law enforcement was over before it had really begun. The phone call came at 6:30 a.m. the next morning. Ryan was barely awake when Inspector Clark's voice cut through the silence of his hotel room. "Detective Torres, I need you at Scotland Yard immediately. We have a situation." Ryan's stomach dropped. He'd been dreading this call since yesterday's incident at Buckingham Palace. The way Inspector Clark said, "situation," told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't going to be a friendly chat over tea and biscuits. 20 minutes later, Ryan found himself sitting in a conference room that felt more like a courtroom. Inspector Clark was there, along with several other officials he didn't recognize. The atmosphere was so tense you could cut it with a knife. "Detective Torres," Inspector Clark began, his usual polite tone replaced by something much colder. "We need to discuss yesterday's incident." Ryan had spent most of the night replaying the events in his head. Every time he thought about it, he felt worse. Klaus Müller, the innocent German tourist, had been nothing but gracious about the whole thing. That somehow made it even more embarrassing. "I want to apologize again for what happened," Ryan started, but Inspector Clark held up his hand. "Apologizing isn't going to fix this, Detective. Do you have any idea how serious this is? You physically detained a foreign national in front of one of our most important landmarks, without authorization, without following any proper protocol." One of the other officials, a stern woman in a navy suit, opened a folder on the table. "We've received calls from the German embassy, the tourism board, and 3 different news organizations. Someone recorded the entire incident on their phone." Ryan's heart sank even further. In today's world, everything ended up online. He could already imagine the headlines: "American cop attacks innocent tourist," or "SWAT officer goes rogue in London." "Sir, I understand I made a mistake, but I was acting on what I believed was a genuine security threat. In my experience, your experience, Inspector Clark interrupted, is precisely the problem. You're not in Los Angeles anymore, Detective. You can't simply charge in like some action movie hero and sort things out later. The criticism stung because Ryan knew it was partly true. He had acted on instinct, using tactics that worked back. But he also knew that if Klaus Mueller had actually been a threat, his quick action could have saved lives. Meanwhile, across London at Wellington Barracks, Guardsman Billy Thompson was facing his own uncomfortable meeting. He sat at attention in front of Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, trying to explain what he'd witnessed the day before. "So let me understand this correctly, Thompson," the lieutenant colonel said, reviewing the incident report. "You watched an American police officer tackle a tourist, and you did nothing?" Billy felt the weight of centuries of military tradition pressing down on him. "Sir, my orders were to maintain my post unless there was a direct threat to the royal family or palace property. The incident occurred outside the security perimeter. But you saw what was happening. You could have intervened, prevented an international incident. Sir, with respect, intervening would have meant abandoning my post. That goes against everything we're taught about ceremonial duties." Lieutenant Colonel Harrison leaned back in his chair. Billy could see the frustration in his superior's eyes. The British military prided itself on following proper procedures, but sometimes those procedures didn't account for unusual situations. "Thompson, you've served 2 tours in Afghanistan. You've seen real combat. Are you telling me you couldn't tell the difference between a security threat and a tourist with a guidebook?" That question hit harder than Billy expected. The truth was, he had recognized that Klaus Mueller wasn't a threat. His combat experience had taught him to read people, to spot real danger. But his ceremonial training had taught him something else entirely. Never break protocol. Never abandon your post. Never act without explicit orders. "Sir, in Afghanistan, the rules were different. Here we follow ceremonial protocol. I was told that maintaining the dignity and tradition of the Guard was more important than individual judgment calls." Back at Scotland Yard, Ryan's meeting was getting worse by the minute. The woman in the Navy suit, who turned out to be from the Foreign Office, was explaining the diplomatic implications of his actions. "Detective Torres, you may not realize this, but your behavior reflects not just on yourself, but on the entire American law enforcement community. We have carefully maintained relationships with our international partners, and incidents like this damage those relationships." Ryan wanted to argue, to explain that American police officers were trained to act decisively when they saw potential threats. But he was beginning to understand that this wasn't really about police work at all. It was about culture, tradition, and the very different ways that Americans and British people approached problems. Inspector Clark pulled out his phone and showed Ryan something that made his blood run cold. It was a video posted on social media with the title, "American Cop Goes Crazy at Buckingham Palace." In just 18 hours, it had been viewed over 200,000 times. "The comments," Inspector Clark said grimly, "are not particularly flattering to either you or American law enforcement in general." Ryan scrolled through a few of the comments. "Typical American aggression. This is why we don't need guns everywhere. Poor tourists just wanted to learn about history." Each comment felt like a punch to the gut, but what bothered Ryan most wasn't the criticism of his actions. It was the way people were using his mistake to make broader judgments about American police officers, American culture, and Americans in general. He thought about his partner, Mike, back in L.A., about his captain, about all the good cops he'd worked with over the years. They didn't deserve to be judged based on his screw-up. The Foreign Office woman continued her lecture. "What you need to understand, detective, is that policing here isn't just about stopping bad guys. It's about maintaining public confidence, preserving social order, and respecting the traditions that hold our society together." "With respect, ma'am," Ryan said, finally finding his voice, "those traditions don't mean much if people get hurt. Because we're too worried about protocol to act when we see a threat." The room went quiet. Inspector Clark looked at him with something that might have been disappointment or maybe just exhaustion. "Detective Torres, that attitude is exactly why this exchange program exists. You're here to learn that there are different ways to approach law enforcement, ways that don't involve treating every situation like a potential shootout. Meanwhile, Billy Thompson was discovering that his own troubles were just beginning. Word of the incident had reached the highest levels of the household division, and questions were being asked about why a trained soldier had stood by while an international incident unfolded right in front of him. "Thompson," Lieutenant Colonel Harrison said, "I'm placing you on administrative review pending a full investigation of this incident. You'll continue your ceremonial duties, but there will be additional training requirements." Billy felt his stomach drop. Administrative review was one step away from formal disciplinary action. His years of spotless service, his combat decorations, his perfect record, all of it was now overshadowed by one moment when he'd followed protocol instead of using his judgment. "Sir, I followed my orders exactly as given." "Sometimes, Thompson, following orders isn't enough. Sometimes you need to think about the bigger." As Billy left the lieutenant colonel's office, he couldn't help but think about the irony of the situation. He'd been criticized for following orders too strictly, while the American officer was being criticized for not following orders strictly enough. That evening, Ryan sat in his hotel room, staring at his phone. He'd already received 3 calls from his captain back in L.A., each one more concerned than the last. The story had somehow made its way to American news outlets, and his department was getting questions from reporters. He thought about calling his wife, but he wasn't sure what to say. How do you explain that you'd embarrassed yourself, your country, and your profession all in one spectacular moment of cultural misunderstanding? The worst part was that he still believed he'd done the right thing from a tactical standpoint. If Klaus Mueller had been a real threat, Ryan's quick action could have prevented a tragedy. But in the court of public opinion, and apparently in the eyes of British law enforcement, being right about tactics didn't matter if you were wrong about everything else. As he finally drifted off to sleep, Ryan wondered if the next 5 months in London would be about learning British police methods or simply trying to repair the damage he'd already done. 2 weeks after the incident, Ryan Torres felt like he was living in a fishbowl. Every day at Scotland Yard brought new reminders of his mistake. Colleagues who used to greet him warmly now gave polite nods and hurried past. The easy conversations over coffee had dried up. Replaced by awkward silences and careful small talk about the weather, the media attention hadn't died down like everyone hoped. If anything, it was getting worse. A British tabloid had picked up the story and was running it with the headline, "Cowboy Cops Palace Panic." They'd somehow gotten hold of Ryan's service record and were painting him as a trigger-happy American who couldn't adapt to civilized policing. Ryan's wife called him every night now, worried about what she was reading online. "The neighbors are asking questions," she told him during their evening video call. "Mrs. Peterson showed me an article on her tablet. It makes you sound like some kind of rogue officer." "I know, honey. I'm trying to keep my head down and get through this. Maybe you should just come home. Take early leave or something. This can't be good for your career." Ryan had thought about it more than once, but giving up and running home felt like admitting defeat. Besides, his captain had made it clear that coming home early wouldn't solve the problem. The story would follow him back to L.A. Meanwhile, at Wellington Barracks, Billy Thompson was discovering what it meant to be under official review. Every aspect of his performance was being scrutinized. His uniform had to be perfect, his drill movements flawless, his conduct beyond reproach. The slightest mistake would be noted and filed away as evidence that he wasn't living up to the standards expected of the Queen's Guard. The other guardsmen were supportive, but Billy could feel the weight of their collective concern. The reputation of the entire unit was at stake. In 8 years of service, Billy had never been the center of controversy. Now he felt like he was letting down centuries of tradition. "It's not fair, mate," his roommate Danny said one evening as they polished their boots. "You followed orders exactly as you were supposed to. How were you meant to know that American would go mental?" Billy appreciated the support, but it didn't make him feel better. The truth was, he kept replaying that moment in his head, wondering if he could have done something different. Not breaking protocol, but maybe finding a way to signal to someone. To prevent the whole mess from happening, the worst part was the media attention. A photographer had somehow gotten a picture of Billy at his post and was using it in articles about Britain's passive police state and when following orders goes too wrong. Seeing his face attached to those headlines made him feel sick back. At Scotland Yard, Ryan was learning that being a pariah was exhausting. He'd been reassigned to desk duty for the remainder of his cultural orientation period. Instead of observing active police work, he was reviewing old case files and writing reports that nobody would ever read Inspector Clark had made. It's clear that this wasn't technically a punishment, just a recalibration of responsibilities. But everyone knew what it really was. Ryan was being kept as far away from actual police work as possible until his exchange period ended and he could be quietly sent back to America. The isolation was getting to him. Ryan had always been a social person, someone who built easy friendships with colleagues. Now he ate lunch alone, worked in a cubicle by himself, and went straight back to his hotel room every evening. The only person who still talked to him normally was the elderly security guard at the front desk, who seemed completely unaware of the whole controversy. "Lovely weather today, Detective Torres," the guard would say cheerfully each morning. "Hope you're enjoying your time in London." Ryan appreciated those small moments of normalcy more than the old man could possibly know. 3 weeks after the incident, something unexpected happened. Ryan was reviewing files in his lonely cubicle when Inspector Clark appeared with a stack of papers and an expression Ryan couldn't read. "Detective Torres, we need to talk." Ryan's heart sank. He figured this was it. They were sending him home early. Probably for the best, really. The exchange program clearly wasn't working out, but instead of termination papers, Inspector Clark set down what looked like incident reports and newspaper clippings. "I've been reviewing your service record from Los Angeles," Inspector Clark said, settling into the chair across from Ryan's desk. 15 years of exemplary service, 43 successful operations, multiple commendations for bravery and sound judgment. Ryan wasn't sure where this was going, but it didn't sound like he was getting fired, at least not yet. "Sir, I appreciate that, but my record back home doesn't excuse what happened here." "No, it doesn't, but it does raise some questions." "Inspector," Clark spread out the papers. "You see, Detective Torres, after the initial shock of your dramatic intervention, we decided to do some research. We looked into every case you've worked, every decision you've made under pressure." Ryan waited, not sure if this was good news or bad news. "What we found was interesting. Your instincts, while completely inappropriate for our setting, have been remarkably accurate over the years. In Los Angeles, your quick threat assessments have prevented 6 potential disasters and saved an estimated 23 lives." This was not what Ryan had expected to hear. For weeks, everyone had been telling him how wrong he was, how his American approach was too aggressive, too hasty. Now Inspector Clark was suggesting that maybe, just maybe, there was value in his methods. "The problem," Inspector Clark continued, "isn't that your instincts are wrong. It's that you're applying them in the wrong context. What works in downtown Los Angeles doesn't necessarily work at Buckingham Palace." Meanwhile, Billy Thompson was having his own unexpected conversation. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison had called him in for what Billy assumed would be another lecture about following orders versus using judgment. Instead, he found his commanding officer reviewing Billy's combat service record. "Thompson, I've been thinking about our previous conversations. You mentioned that in Afghanistan, the rules were different." "Yes, sir. In a combat zone, you have to make split-second decisions based on immediate threats, and you were good at that. Your record shows exceptional judgment under fire. 3 citations for tactical excellence, 2 for saving fellow soldiers through quick thinking." Billy wasn't sure where this was heading, but the tone was different from their previous meetings, less accusatory, more thoughtful. "What I'm beginning to understand," Lieutenant Colonel Harrison said, "is that we may have overcorrected. In our effort to maintain ceremonial perfection, we may have trained some of the practical judgment out of you." This was a surprising admission from a man who'd built his career on military precision and following orders. Sir, are you saying I should have broken protocol? No, Thompson. I'm saying that maybe our protocol needs to account for unusual situations. Maybe there's a way to maintain tradition while still allowing for practical judgment. Back at Scotland Yard, Ryan was struggling to process what Inspector Clark was telling him. Detective Torres, we've had exchange officers before, but none quite like you. Most adapt to our methods fairly quickly. You forced us to examine whether our methods are always the best approach. I'm not sure I understand, sir. What I'm saying is this: maybe the problem isn't entirely with your approach. Maybe it's that we haven't found a way to blend your strengths with our traditions. Ryan felt a flicker of hope for the first time in weeks. Are you saying I'm not being sent home? Not yet. But we are making some changes to your assignment. Instead of pure observation, we're going to try something new. A joint training program. You'll work with one of our ceremonial guards who's also under review. Which guard? Inspector Clark smiled for the first time since the incident. Guardsman Thompson? I believe you two have met. Ryan's stomach dropped again. Working with the guard he'd embarrassed in front of half of London? This felt less like a second chance and more like a recipe for disaster, but as he thought about it, Ryan realized something. For the first time in weeks, someone was suggesting that maybe, just maybe, his approach wasn't completely wrong. It was just being used in the wrong place, at the wrong time. Maybe there was hope after all. The meeting room at Scotland Yard felt like a neutral zone between two warring countries. Ryan Torres sat on one side of the conference table, Billy Thompson on the other. Between them lay weeks of awkwardness, embarrassment, and mutual blame that neither man was quite ready to address. Inspector Clark had left them alone with a simple instruction: figure out how to work together, or you'll both be looking for new careers. For the first 10 minutes, neither man spoke. Ryan stared at his hands while Billy examined the ceiling tiles as if they contained the secrets of the universe. The silence was so thick you could practically cut it with a knife. Finally, Ryan cleared his throat. Look, I know this is weird for both of us. Billy nodded but didn't say anything. He was still trying to process how he'd gone from being a respected guardsman to sitting in a disciplinary meeting with the American who'd caused all his problems. I want you to know, Ryan continued, I never meant to put you in a bad position. I was just doing what my training told me to do. Your training, Billy said quietly, speaking for the first time, nearly got both of us fired. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Ryan felt his defensive instincts kick in, but he forced himself to stay calm. Getting into an argument wouldn't help either of them. You're right, Ryan said, surprising Billy with his honesty. My training was wrong for that situation. But I need you to understand something. Where I come from, hesitating for even a second can mean the difference between life and death. Billy looked at Ryan for the first time since they'd sat down. And where I come from, breaking protocol can mean disgrace for an entire regiment that's served the crown for over 300 years. They were both quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. Less hostile, more thoughtful. Ryan had spent weeks thinking about that day at Buckingham Palace. Not just his own actions, but what he'd observed from Billy. Can I ask you something? When you saw me moving toward that tourist, what was going through your head? Billy shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Honestly, I knew you were making a mistake. My combat experience told me that man wasn't a threat. But my ceremonial training told me to stay at my post no matter what. So you saw the same thing I saw, but you interpreted it differently? No, Billy said slowly. I think we saw completely different things. You saw potential danger that needed immediate action. I saw a situation that required careful assessment and proper procedure. Ryan leaned back in his chair, processing this. So we were both doing our jobs the way we were trained to do them, and we both got in trouble for it. For the first time since the incident, Ryan almost smiled. Yeah, we really messed this up, didn't we? Billy found himself almost smiling. Too spectacularly. The ice was starting to break, but they still had a long way to go. Inspector Clark had given them a week to come up with a joint training proposal that would satisfy both the Metropolitan Police and the Household Division. Neither man had any idea what that would look like. "Okay," Ryan said, pulling out a notepad. "Let's start with what we each bring to the table. I've got 15 years of tactical experience, threat assessment, and crisis response. And I've got 8 years of ceremonial duties, crowd control, and while standing very still for long periods of time." Ryan looked up from his notes. "You know, that last one might be more important than you think. In LA, we're always moving, always reacting. Sometimes we miss things because we're not taking time to really observe." Billy hadn't thought about his guard duties that way before. "You really think standing still is a useful skill? Are you kidding? You notice everything? You can't turn your head, can't move your eyes obviously, but you're constantly aware of what's happening around you. That's incredible situational awareness." For the first time in weeks, Billy felt like maybe his skills had value, beyond just looking impressive for tourists. "What about your combat experience?" Ryan asked. "You served in Afghanistan, right?" "2 tours, but that feels like a lifetime ago." "Ceremonial duty is so different from combat operations." "Maybe it doesn't have to be? What if we could combine the best of both? The awareness and discipline of ceremonial duty with the tactical readiness of combat operations?" Billy was intrigued despite himself. "What do you mean?" Ryan started sketching on his notepad. "Think about it. You guys are already in position at every major landmark in London. You're trained observers, you understand crowd dynamics, and you're literally right there if something goes wrong. But you're limited by protocols that don't account for modern threats. And you're suggesting we change 3 centuries of tradition?" "No, I'm suggesting we enhance it. Keep everything that works, the discipline, the presence, the respect for protocol, but add layers that allow for flexibility when situations require it." Billy found himself getting interested despite his reservations. "Like what kind of layers?" "Well, what if guardsmen had discrete communication methods? Ways to alert security without breaking formation? What if there were predetermined signals for different types of situations?" "We actually do have some of that already," Billy admitted. "There are protocols for medical emergencies, threats to the royal family, things like that. So we expand on those. Create a system that covers more situations but still maintains the dignity and tradition of the Guard." They spent the next hour talking through possibilities. Ryan learned that the ceremonial guards were far more sophisticated than he'd realized. They underwent extensive security training, maintained constant communication with command centers, and followed complex protocols that had evolved over centuries. Billy discovered that American police tactics weren't just about charging in with guns blazing. There were layers of assessment, de-escalation techniques, and careful coordination that he hadn't seen in that chaotic moment at the palace. "Gates, you know what I think the real problem was?" Billy said as their discussion wound down. "We were both operating in isolation. You didn't understand our protocols, and I didn't understand your assessment process. So if we'd been able to communicate for just 30 seconds, the whole thing might have been avoided. You could have explained what you were seeing. I could have explained the proper procedure for investigating suspicious behavior." Ryan nodded thoughtfully. "Instead, we both just did what we thought was right based on our own training, and created an international incident in the process." They were both quiet again, but this time it was companionable rather than hostile. Ryan found himself genuinely liking Billy Thompson. The guy was smart, thoughtful, and clearly dedicated to his job. Under different circumstances, they probably would have gotten along well. "Can I ask you something personal?" Ryan said. "How did your family react to all this?" Billy grimaced. "My dad served in the same regiment 40 years ago. He's not pleased. Says I've brought shame on the family name." "Ouch, that's rough. What about you?" "Your wife seemed supportive from what I've heard." Ryan was surprised Billy knew about his wife. "She is, but she's worried. The story made it back to LA, and now everyone's watching to see what happens to me. If this doesn't work out, it could affect my career back home too. So we're both fighting for our professional lives." "Pretty much." Billy leaned forward in his chair. Then we better make this work. Ryan looked at his new partner, because that's what Billy was now, whether either of them had planned it or not. Yeah, we better. As they left the meeting room. That evening, both men felt something they hadn't experienced in weeks: hope. They still had a lot of work ahead of them, and there was no guarantee their superiors would accept whatever proposal they came up with. But for the first time since the incident, they weren't facing the future alone. Tomorrow, they would start the real work of figuring out how to blend two very different approaches to protecting people. Tonight, they could at least go home knowing they'd found a way to talk to each other without wanting to throw punches. It was a start. 3 days into their forced partnership, Ryan and Billy were still trying to figure out how to work together when the emergency call came through. It was a gray Thursday afternoon, and they'd been reviewing security protocols in a stuffy conference room when Inspector Clark burst in with an urgency neither man had seen before. "Right, you two. We've got a situation developing near Parliament. Major protest that's turned nasty. Intelligence suggests some of the protesters may be armed, and it's escalating fast." Ryan felt his adrenaline spike immediately. This was the kind of situation he'd been trained for his entire career. Billy, meanwhile, felt a familiar knot form in his stomach, the same feeling he'd had before every dangerous patrol in Afghanistan. "What's our role?" Ryan asked, already mentally shifting into tactical mode. "You're observing," Inspector Clark said firmly. "Both of you. But given the circumstances, you'll be closer to the action than usual. Consider it a field test of your cooperation." As they rushed through the corridors of Scotland Yard, Billy caught Ryan's arm. "Before we get there, we need to be clear about something. I'm not going to watch you tackle innocent people again. And I'm not going to watch you stand around following protocol while people get hurt." Ryan shot back. They stared at each other for a moment, and then Billy surprised Ryan by extending his hand. "So let's make sure we communicate this time." Ryan shook it. "Deal." The scene outside Parliament was chaos. What had started as a peaceful demonstration about housing policy had turned into something much more serious. Protesters were pushing against police barriers. Shouting was echoing off the historic buildings, and Ryan could see several groups that looked more organized and aggressive than typical demonstrators. "There," Billy said quietly, pointing toward a cluster of men near the main crowd. "Those guys aren't here to protest. Look at how they're positioned." Ryan followed Billy's gaze and immediately saw what he meant. While most protesters were facing the Parliament building, this group was watching the police response, studying their movements, looking for weaknesses in the security setup. "You're right, they're doing reconnaissance." Question is, reconnaissance for what? As if answering Billy's question, one of the suspicious men pulled out what looked like a radio and spoke into it briefly. Within seconds, several other individuals in different parts of the crowd began moving with purpose. "That's coordination," Ryan said, his voice tense. "This isn't random anymore." They watched as the coordinated individuals began spreading out through the crowd, each taking positions that would give them tactical advantages if violence broke out. It was exactly the kind of pre-operational behavior Ryan had been trained to spot. "We need to alert command," Billy said, reaching for his radio, but before he could make the call, everything went wrong at once. A group of aggressive protesters suddenly rushed one of the police barriers, overwhelming the officers trying to maintain the perimeter. At the same time, several smoke canisters went off in different parts of the crowd, creating confusion and reducing visibility. The coordinated individuals that Ryan and Billy had spotted immediately took advantage of the chaos. "This is planned," Ryan said, his training taking over. "They're using the protest as cover for something bigger." Billy was already on his radio trying to get through to command, but the airwaves were jammed with emergency calls from officers throughout the area. The situation was deteriorating faster than anyone had anticipated. Through the smoke and confusion, Ryan spotted something that made his blood run cold. One of the coordinated men was pulling what looked like a weapon from inside his jacket. But this time, unlike the incident at Buckingham Palace, Ryan wasn't acting alone. "Billy, 2 o'clock? Man in the blue jacket? Tell me what you see." Billy immediately focused on the area Ryan indicated. His military training kicked in, and he assessed the situation with the same calm precision he'd used in Afghanistan. Confirmed. That's a weapon. Pistol, probably 9mm based on his grip. Okay, so we both see it. What's the proper procedure here? Billy was already thinking through the protocols. Alert armed response, establish perimeter, evacuate civilians from the immediate area. How long for armed response to get here? At least 5 minutes in this chaos. Ryan looked at the crowd between them and the armed man. Hundreds of innocent people, including families with children who'd gotten caught up in what was supposed to be a peaceful demonstration. 5 minutes is too long. He's moving toward the main crowd. Billy saw it too. The armed man wasn't trying to escape. He was positioning himself to cause maximum damage. We can't let him reach that group of families. This was the moment that would define whether their partnership meant anything. Ryan had all the tactical training to stop an armed threat, but he'd already proven he couldn't operate in London without creating international incidents. Billy had the authority and local knowledge, but his ceremonial training hadn't prepared him for active shooter situations. What if we work together? Ryan said, his mind racing through possibilities. You handle communications and crowd control? I handle threat neutralization? That could work. But you follow my lead on procedure this time. Deal. Billy immediately got on his radio with a calm, clear voice that cut through the chaos. Command, this is Guardsman Thompson. We have eyes on an armed individual in Sector 7. Requesting immediate armed response and crowd evacuation protocols. While Billy coordinated with command, Ryan began moving through the crowd, using his knowledge of tactical positioning to get closer to the threat without being detected. But this time, instead of charging in alone, he stayed in constant communication with Billy. I'm 20 meters from target. He's definitely armed, definitely focused on the civilian crowd. Armed response is 2 minutes out. Can you maintain? Visual without engagement? Negative. He's moving toward a group of school children. Their teacher doesn't see him coming. This was the test. Everything they talked about in that conference room, all their discussions about communication and cooperation, came down to this moment. Billy made a decision that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. Ryan, you're authorized to intervene. But wait for my signal. Billy then did something that combined his ceremonial training with his military experience. He used his authority as a guardsman to begin directing crowd movement, creating a clear path for Ryan while simultaneously alerting nearby police officers to the threat. Ladies and gentlemen, Billy called out in his crisp military voice that somehow carried over the chaos, please move away from the barrier area immediately. Follow the officer's directions for your safety. His tone had the weight of authority that people instinctively responded to. The crowd began moving, creating the space Ryan needed. Now, Billy said into his radio, Ryan moved with precision, but not with the aggressive tactics he'd used at Buckingham Palace. Instead, he approached the armed man from behind, using the crowd movement Billy had created to mask his approach. Police! Drop your weapon. The armed man spun around, surprised to find an officer so close. For a moment, Ryan thought the situation might escalate into violence. But then something unexpected happened. The man looked around and realized he was surrounded. Billy's crowd control had not only created space for Ryan to operate, but had also isolated the threat from his support network. The coordinated attack was falling apart. Drop the weapon and get on the ground, Ryan commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd done this many times before. The man hesitated, then slowly placed his pistol on the ground and raised his hands. By the time armed response units arrived, Ryan and Billy had successfully prevented what intelligence later confirmed was a planned attack designed to use the protest as cover for an assault on Parliament. As they watched the suspects being led away in handcuffs, Billy turned to Ryan with something like amazement in his voice. We actually did it. Yeah, Ryan said, still processing what had happened. We did. For the first time since Ryan had arrived in London, he felt like he belonged there. And for the first time since the Buckingham Palace incident, Billy felt like his skills had real Value beyond standing perfectly still. They'd found a way to make it work. The morning after the Parliament incident, Ryan woke up to something he hadn't experienced in weeks. His phone, buzzing with congratulatory messages instead of angry complaints. News of how he and Billy had prevented a potential attack had spread through both the Metropolitan Police and the Household Division. For the first time since arriving in London, Ryan felt like he might actually succeed in this assignment. Billy was having a similar experience at Wellington Barracks. His fellow guardsmen, who had been quietly supportive but worried during his disciplinary review, were now slapping him on the back and asking for details about the operation. Even Lieutenant Colonel Harrison had nodded approvingly when they passed in the corridor, but the real validation came that afternoon when both men were called to an emergency meeting at Scotland Yard. Instead of the disciplinary conference room they'd grown to dread, they were led to the commissioner's office, a place neither had ever expected to see. Commissioner Patricia Webb was a small woman with gray hair and sharp eyes, who'd earned her position through 30 years of exceptional service. She gestured for them to sit across from her enormous desk, which was covered with reports and newspaper clippings. "Gentlemen," she began, "yesterday's operation has generated quite a bit of interest. Not just from our departments, but from security agencies across Europe." Ryan and Billy exchanged glances. They'd expected some recognition for preventing the attack, but European attention was something else entirely. "What you two accomplished wasn't just good police work," Commissioner Webb continued. "You created something new, a fusion of American tactical efficiency with British procedural excellence. And you did it under the worst possible circumstances." She pulled out a thick folder and set it on the desk. "This contains analysis from our tactical experts, feedback from international security consultants, and recommendations from people much smarter than any of us. They all say the same thing. What you did yesterday should become standard procedure." Billy found his voice first. "Standard procedure, ma'am?" "That's right, Guardsman Thompson. We want you two to develop a formal training program based on your methods, something we can teach to both regular police officers and ceremonial guards." Ryan felt a surge of excitement, but also nervousness. "Commissioner, with respect, we kind of made it up as we went along yesterday. I'm not sure we have a formal method yet," Commissioner Webb smiled. "Detective Torres, the best innovations often come from people who have to solve problems in real time. What you two figured out under pressure took our best theoretical minds months to even conceptualize." She opened the folder and showed them pages of detailed analysis. Charts showing response times, effectiveness ratings, and coordination metrics that Ryan didn't even know were being measured. "Your combined approach reduced response time by 40%, while improving accuracy of threat assessment by 60%. Those aren't just good numbers, they're revolutionary numbers." Billy was struggling to process this information. A week ago, he'd been facing potential dismissal from the service. Now he was being asked to help redesign training protocols for the entire organization. "Ma'am, I'm honored, but I'm not sure I'm qualified to design training programs. I'm just, a guardsman?" "Guardsman Thompson, you're a combat veteran who understands both traditional military discipline and modern threat assessment. Detective Torres is a tactical expert who's learned to appreciate the value of protocol and measured response. Together you represent exactly what modern security needs." Over the next 2 hours, Commissioner Webb outlined what she had in mind. Ryan and Billy would spend the next 3 months developing a comprehensive training program that combined American SWAT tactics with British ceremonial precision. They'd work with experts from both organizations, test their methods with volunteer units, and create something that could be implemented across multiple agencies. "The goal," Commissioner Webb explained, "isn't to replace either approach, but to create a new synthesis. We want officers who can think tactically while respecting protocol, and guardsmen who can maintain tradition while adapting to modern threats." As they left the commissioner's office, both men were quiet, overwhelmed by the scope of what they'd been asked to do. Finally, Ryan broke the silence. "Billy, do you realize what just happened? We went from being disciplinary problems to being asked to redesign international security training." It doesn't feel real, Billy admitted. A month ago, I thought my career was over. Now they want me to help train other people. They spent the rest of the week in intense planning sessions, working with training specialists, security experts, and behavioral psychologists. What emerged was something neither man had expected, a training philosophy that was as much about communication and cultural understanding as it was about tactics. The key insight, explained Dr. Rachel Harrison, the behavioral psychologist assigned to their team, is that you two succeeded not because you found the perfect compromise between your methods, but because you learned to speak each other's languages. Ryan had never thought about it that way, but it made sense. You mean the real breakthrough wasn't tactical? Not entirely. Yes, combining rapid response with measured assessment is valuable, but the bigger innovation was creating a system where different types of training and experience could complement each other in real time. Billy nodded slowly. Like having a conversation instead of just following separate procedures. Exactly. You created a dynamic partnership where each person's strengths covered the other's limitations. As word of their project spread, requests for information began coming in from police departments and military units across Europe. The French National Police wanted to know about their crowd control innovations. German federal police were interested in their threat assessment protocols. Even American SWAT teams were asking for details about incorporating ceremonial discipline into tactical operations. It's funny, Ryan told his wife during one of their evening calls. I came here thinking I was going to teach British cops how to be more like American cops. Instead, I'm learning that the best approach might be something completely different. From either one. You sound happy, she said. Happier than you've been since you left. Ryan realized she was right. For the first time in his career, he felt like he was doing more than just his job. He was creating something new, something that could help people he'd never meet in situations he'd never face. Billy was having similar conversations with his family. His father, who'd been so disappointed about the disciplinary review, was now proudly telling neighbors about his son's innovative work with international security. I still don't completely understand what you're doing, his father admitted, during a weekend visit, but the newspaper article made it sound quite important. It feels important, Dad, like we're building something that could actually make a difference. The real test of their developing system came during a training exercise with volunteer units from both organizations. They'd set up a simulated scenario involving a suspicious package near Westminster Abbey, with both tourists and ceremonial guards in the area watching their trainees work through the scenario. Ryan and Billy saw their ideas come to life. American officers learned to use the observational skills and disciplined communication of ceremonial guards. British guardsmen learned rapid threat assessment and flexible response tactics, but more importantly, both groups learned to work together as integrated teams rather than separate units with conflicting priorities. Look at that, Billy said, pointing to a mixed team of police officers and guardsmen who were seamlessly coordinating their response to the simulated threat. They're not thinking about American methods or British methods. They're just thinking about the best way to handle the situation. Ryan watched with pride as his tactical training merged with Billy's disciplinary approach to create something neither could have achieved alone. You know what this means, don't you? What? We've accidentally invented the future of law enforcement, Billy laughed. Well, when you put it that way, it sounds rather important. As their 3-month development period neared its end, both men knew they'd created something special. But they also knew the real test would come when their methods were put into practice by other people. In other places facing real threats, the innovation was complete. Now they had to prove it would work in the real world. 6 months later, Ryan Torres stood in front of the most diverse group of law enforcement officers he'd ever seen. Police from 12 different countries filled the training facility at Scotland Yard, all there to learn what the media had started calling the London method. Next to him, Billy Thompson adjusted his new instructor's uniform, a unique design that combined elements of both police and military dress, symbolizing the fusion they'd created. Good morning, everyone, Ryan began, looking out at faces from Germany, France, Canada, Australia, and 8 other nations. 6 months ago, Billy and I were both facing the end of our careers. Today, we're here to share something that started as the worst mistake either of us had ever made. A ripple of laughter went through the audience. The story of their initial disaster at Buckingham Palace had become legendary in law enforcement circles, not as a cautionary tale, but as proof that even the biggest failures could lead to breakthrough innovations. Billy stepped forward. What we're going to teach you over the next 2 weeks isn't just about combining American and British techniques. It's about learning to see situations from multiple perspectives and responding with both speed and wisdom. The program they developed had evolved far beyond their original crisis at Parliament. Working with experts from around the world, they'd created a comprehensive training system that was already being implemented in major cities across 3 continents. The first group of students included Captain Rodriguez from the Madrid Police, Inspector Mueller from Berlin's Special Response Unit, and Sergeant Chun from the Toronto Police Service. Each brought their own methods and cultural approaches to policing, creating exactly the kind of diverse learning environment Ryan and Billy had hoped for. The core principle, Billy explained as they moved into the practical training area, is what we call dynamic protocol. It means maintaining structure and discipline while staying flexible, enough to adapt to unexpected situations, Ryan demonstrated the tactical elements while Billy showed how to maintain communication and coordination even in high-stress scenarios. But the real magic happened when the international officers began working together, bringing their own expertise into the mix. Captain Rodriguez, who had extensive experience with crowd control during political demonstrations, showed how Spanish police use psychological techniques to de-escalate tensions. Inspector Mueller contributed German precision planning methods that help predict and prevent security breaches before they developed. This is what we always hoped would happen, Ryan told Billy during a break between sessions. We started with American and British methods, but now we're learning from everyone. It's like building something bigger than any of us could create alone. Billy agreed, watching as officers from different countries worked through a complex scenario involving multiple types of threats. The real validation of their methods came during the second week, when they received an unexpected visit from Commissioner Webb and General Morrison, the head of the Household Division. Both had come to observe a full-scale exercise that would test everything the international officers had learned. The scenario was intentionally complex: a state dinner at a London hotel with multiple VIPs, protest groups outside, and intelligence suggesting a coordinated threat from an unknown source. The international teams would have to work together using the London method while dealing with language barriers, cultural differences, and the pressure of being evaluated by top officials. Remember, Ryan told the teams as they prepared, this isn't about being perfect. It's about communicating, adapting, and supporting each other. As the exercise began, Ryan and Billy watched with pride as officers who'd never worked together before began functioning like a coordinated unit. Captain Rodriguez used his crowd psychology expertise to predict protest movements. Inspector Mueller's planning methods helped anticipate security vulnerabilities. Sergeant Chen's community policing experience proved valuable for coordinating with hotel staff and local residents. But the most impressive moment came when the exercise threw them an unexpected challenge: a simulated medical emergency involving one of the VIPs during a period of heightened security alert. Instead of following rigid protocols that would have conflicted with each other, the international team adapted on the fly. They created secure corridors for medical personnel while maintaining threat assessment protocols, coordinated communications across multiple agencies, and managed crowd control without compromising the medical response. Brilliant, Commissioner, Webb murmured to General Morrison as they watched the seamless response. They're not just following procedures, they're thinking. When the exercise ended, the visiting officials were clearly impressed. General Morrison, a man not known for showing emotion, approached Ryan and Billy with something close to a smile. Gentlemen, I've been skeptical of innovation for most of my career. I believe in tradition, in time-tested methods. But what I've seen here today convinces me that sometimes tradition needs to evolve. Commissioner Webb nodded in agreement. The Home Office has already approved expansion of this program. We'll be implementing London method training across all metropolitan police forces within the year. But the biggest surprise came from Captain Rodriguez, who approached them after the officials had left. "Ryan, Billy, I have a proposal. Madrid wants to host the next international training session. We'd like to add Spanish crowd psychology techniques to your program." Inspector Mueller overheard and joined the conversation. "Berlin is interested. As well, we could contribute our crisis prediction models." Within an hour, what had started as a British-American collaboration was evolving into a truly international initiative. Countries were volunteering to host future training sessions, each offering to contribute their own expertise to the growing methodology. "Do you realize what's happening here?" Billy asked Ryan as they watched the international officers exchange contact information and plan future collaborations. "We're not just teaching them our methods, they're building on them, making them better." Ryan looked around at the diverse group of professionals who'd come from around the world to learn something that had started with his massive mistake at a tourist attraction. "You know what the craziest part is? None of this would have happened if I hadn't screwed up so spectacularly that first day. And none of it would have worked if we hadn't learned to talk to each other instead of just following our own training." As the international officers prepared to return to their home countries, many carrying training materials and certification to teach the London method themselves, Ryan reflected on how much had changed. He'd come to London as a visiting expert, expecting to share American techniques with British police. Instead, he'd learned that the best solutions often came from bringing different perspectives together. Rather than proving one approach was better than another, Billy was having similar thoughts. His entire career had been built on the idea that tradition and discipline meant following established procedures without question. Now he understood that real discipline sometimes meant having the wisdom to adapt those procedures when situations required it. The program's success had already led to concrete results. 3 terrorist plots had been disrupted using London method techniques. Response times to major incidents had improved in every city where the training had been implemented. Most importantly, cooperation between different types of law enforcement agencies, local police, federal agents, military units, and international partners had reached levels nobody had thought possible 6 months after their disastrous first encounter. Ryan and Billy had created something that was being studied at police academies and military schools around the world. Their story had become required reading in crisis management courses, not as an example of what not to do, but as proof that innovation often emerged from the most unexpected places. On Ryan's last day in London, his assignment had been extended. Twice, due to the success of the program, he and Billy stood once again at the gates of Buckingham Palace, the same spot where their partnership had begun with mutual embarrassment and professional disaster. "Hard to believe it all started here," Ryan said, watching tourists take photos with the ceremonial guards. "Looking back, I think it had to start here," Billy replied. "This place represents everything about tradition and protocol. But it's also where we learned that tradition doesn't have to mean staying exactly the same forever." They watched as a new group of guards, trained in the enhanced protocols they'd developed, maintained their ceremonial duties while staying alert for the kinds of threats that hadn't existed when those traditions were first established. "Think they'll remember us?" Ryan asked, gesturing toward the palace. Billy smiled. "I think they'll remember that sometimes the best way to honor the past is to make sure it can adapt to the future." As Ryan headed to the airport for his flight back to Los Angeles, he carried with him more than just good memories and professional success. He'd learned that being right wasn't as important as being willing to learn, and that the best solutions often came from the most unlikely partnerships. Billy returned to his duties as a guardsman, but now he was also a certified international instructor whose expertise was sought by security agencies around the world.